And my name is Lisa Fellows, and I'm going to be hosting today's session. Just a few housekeeping things to remind you. Please keep your phone or your Zoom on mute. Please do not place this on hold. If you have a question during today's session, please either raise your hand or post the question in chat, and Kris will get to it as she makes her way through her presentation. Another reminder that today's session is being recorded. As I said, my name is Lisa Fellows, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Project Management Community Group. I'm from Bucknell University. Today's speaker is going to be Kris Brewster from Drake University. And we're just giving this quick welcome, and we're going to turn it over to Kris to give the keynote, and then we'll review some upcoming events later in the session. Okay. So Kris is going to be talking about Agile prioritization and estimation today. So at this time, I'm going to stop my screen share, and we'll have Kris share her screen.
Thanks, Lisa. Hopefully everyone is seeing my screen okay. Yes, okay. And obviously hearing me all right. Excellent. Two good things. As Lisa said, I'm going to do my best to try and keep an eye on the chat as we go through the presentation today. I may get to questions a little bit later. I might hold them to the end, but we'll try and get questions fit into all of this as well. So first off, as Lisa said, my name is Kris Brewster, and our topic for today is Agile project prioritization and estimation. I start off with just a little bit of background of myself. I don't expect you to read all of this. It is probably really a little bit boring, but I wanted to highlight a couple things. So I really enjoy reading and learning and sharing knowledge that I have with others. And that's especially true in the project management world. I've been a project manager for right around 20 years, and I use my project skills mostly in the IT realm. I am a certified project management professional, and I've also got some master's or a master's degree in project management. Some of my greatest really moments with project management or enjoyments have been mentoring others. So it's something that I really enjoy, is kind of teaching others about project management and helping them understand project management. And the best bonus in all of that is getting to watch them grow their project management skills. At the end of the day, though, I'm really an Iowa girl. I focus on my family. I've got a 9-year-old little girl and my husband, and we like to just kind of hang out with ourselves and with friends and do some traveling and enjoy experiences. So that's just a little bit about me. Sorry if I bored you there, but we'll move on to agenda stuff now. So as I said earlier, our topic for today is really Agile project prioritization and estimation techniques. And as we explore prioritization today, we're going to talk about 4 different methods. And those include Moscow, Kano, relative weighting, and the $100 test. Once we get done with that, we're going to focus in on planning and estimating. And here we're going to cover 5 different topics: affinity sizing, T-shirt sizes, Fibonacci numbers, story points, and planning poker. And then I'm going to round out our time with a walkthrough on how to apply our prioritization and estimation techniques in real life. As we get started, I want to pose a question, and that is really, why do we even bother doing prioritization and estimation for Agile project management? So prioritization is important because it helps us figure out which things are most important and which things are least important, and really lets us determine and focus in on those things that are most important. And estimation becomes important as we get a little bit further down the line and we do our planning. It gives us a way to figure out how much of the items we can include as we do our planning. And before we really dive in on prioritization today, I wanted to find some key components and list some people that we need to engage in order to complete the prioritization of an Agile project. So I'm most familiar with the Scrum approach, and that's what I'm going to be basing today's presentation on. And I want to start by talking about the product owner. The product owner is the person who has really the vision for what we need to do. They're the key stakeholder in the initiative. They're conveying information to the project team and really sharing and providing clarification of what's ahead. So that product owner might also work with some other stakeholders in the organization. And they are going to be kind of making sure that their needs are also represented on the project. The product owner is really going to create for us the product backlog. And we're going to talk about that here coming up next. But in addition to that, they're also doing the product prioritization. So they're defining how important something is or how not important something is. And the work that's ahead, as I said, is on our product backlog. It's written down, it's maintained here. This is where we find what we call user stories. And a user story is simply a statement of what's needed. So as an example, if we were talking about an application for, let's say, shopping at a boutique clothing store, an example of a user story in this case might be, as a user, I'm expecting to receive a confirmation message upon successful submission of my order. Notice we aren't saying at all how we're going to be doing that work, and we're not even breaking it down to identify all of the work that's involved, but we're just saying what's needed and who it is needed by. And so our product backlog throughout an Agile project is a living and breathing document, and it continues to change. It starts out with what we know at the beginning, and then we might add to that, we might subtract from it, or we might update items that we've completed. The last role that really plays into our prioritization work is our Scrum Master. In this case, you can think project manager, although maybe a little bit different than the traditional project manager. So a Scrum Master is really a coach for the Agile team. They're the one who is going to be organizing and facilitating the meetings, but really rather than leading and directing those meetings, they're going to serve and support the project team. So for prioritization, we've got our product backlog, our Scrum Master, and our product owner who are all going to participate. We also, in some cases, might invite some additional key stakeholders into the mix, but that's really what we need to accomplish our prioritization. Now that I've got that all laid out, I also wanted to include just really quickly a sample product backlog and what it might look like. Excuse me. I've done this just in an Excel document. I know in today's world, most people are using technology and different tools to do this work, but I wanted to just keep it simple for presentation purposes. So on this, you can see we're storing our user stories. We're having our priority noted in here. We're also having our estimate noted in here. We might also track status. So really, I think of it more as just a list of what's possibly ahead for a project. And to get things started, our product owner, and maybe others, are going to identify those user stories for us. They're going to write them and place them in the backlog. Then that product owner is going to do a priority assignment. And that priority assignment then gives direction to the team as far as what's most and least important. There's several priority techniques that can be assigned or applied, I guess. And as we go through the next few slides, we're going to start digging in just a little bit more on those techniques. So first up, we've got the Moscow method for prioritization. And you'll notice from the title, we've got some capital letters in it. Those correspond with the 4 categories that you see on the slide. We've got the M, which stands for must have, and those are the user stories that have to be done. And if they're not done, then whatever we're trying to produce or deliver is going to fail. The S stands for should have. These are the next most important items for the product. They're not as critical as the must haves, but they're something that we really should have in place for the project. The C is for could haves. I think of these as a nice to have bucket. So they're not critical items, but they would be really good additions if we have time to add them in and to complete the work for them. And the W's are won't haves. So these are really the items that are not beneficial at this point and that we're not expecting to complete during this project. I think of them as kind of things that get set aside. If I put on my traditional project management hat, I really equate them to more like a parking lot item. So they're kind of items that I'm just not going to entertain at the moment. And when we're evaluating the user stories and assigning that M, that S, that C, or that W, then we can do so, or the product owner can do so, by placing the most weight on stories that have the highest impact to the business. And then once it's been classified from a user story perspective, once that user story has a classification, then that priority gets placed into the product backlog. And then that gives us an easy way to categorize the items that are in the backlog and figure out which ones we might want to tackle first, second, and third. Our next prioritization method is Kano. And this one, I will tell you, on the surface, it looks a little bit intimidating and complicated. I actually broke it out into these 5 different charts. Normally you see it in a single chart with all 5 lines kind of happening all together. And I decided that it might be a little less overwhelming and easier to talk about if I divided it up. So I went ahead and did that. And we're just gonna really focus in on each one of these and talk about examples for them. But before we do that, for Kano, the focus here is really on user satisfaction. So we're determining priority based on how satisfied or delighted or disappointed a user will be with a feature or a user story. And so really, we're using a model that has an X and Y axis. On the X axis, we've got the customer satisfaction, and on the Y axis, we've got whether the feature is available or not available. And so, as I said, there's 5 main buckets or categories that we're trying to place our user stories into for the Kano model. And that gives us a way to compare them. The first categorization is a basic feature. And if you think about the basic features, they're really the items that if they're missing, that customer is going to be so disappointed and they're probably going to walk away from the product and not even engage with it. And so I kind of tried to equate these to some examples, and I have a real love for cars, so I put it into the car world for all of these. But what I decided is, I'm going to the car dealership. I'm going to buy a new car, and I walk on the lot, and I pick the car that I think is the car of my dreams. I open the door, and I figure out that there's no driver's seat in this car. And the first thing that runs through my mind, and I know it sounds a little ridiculous as a scenario, but the first thing that runs through my mind is, how do I even drive this thing? And so that maybe is a situation where, as a consumer, I'm going to walk completely away from that product. And I'm probably going to walk across the lot and find a vehicle that has a driver's seat in it that's usable. So that's an example of a basic feature. If we talk about attractive features, they're really the pleasant surprises. They offer us a lot of excitement as a customer, yet they're not always something that we expect. If they're not there, we're neutral because we don't really know that they should be there. But if they are there, we're really excited and maybe even wowed about it. Again, kind of taking a car analogy here.
Is Kris frozen on other screen? That's just mine.
Yeah, I think we just lost Kris.
There
There
she
she
comes
is.
back.
She's back.
Kris, you're muted now.
All right. Are you guys hearing me again now?
Yes, you're good now.
Okay. I think I lost everybody just momentarily. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
And you're seeing my slide deck okay still too, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll pick back up with performance features. So these are the next ones. And these are the things that the customer really wants more of. They're really satisfied when these user stories are present, and they're really dissatisfied when they're not. So again, thinking in car terms, I'm kind of thinking about the Bluetooth connectivity or device connectivity and how that's grown over the years. You know, we started out with phones connecting to vehicles and being able to do hands-free calling. Then they introduced where your text messages will come in and your car will kind of read those to you. And now I'm seeing inklings that we're connecting in Alexa to vehicles. So I think that's just one of those things where, you know, we're just expecting more. And if we were to revert backwards, I think people would kind of wonder what was going on. And then we move into a couple of other features. One is the indifferent features. And those are things that the customer just doesn't care about. You know, for me personally, it's a sunroof in a vehicle. If it's there, that's great. If it's not there, I'm okay with that too. And finally, we have the reverse features. And those are the things that actually upset a customer when they're available. And they're really glad when they're not there. And I think probably one of the things I've read about most recently in this realm that made me kind of connect dots to this was around the start-stop technology for stopping an engine of a vehicle when it's sitting at a stoplight. And I know there are some people that really dislike that. And so the automakers have started putting in kind of override buttons that let them turn that feature off, so to speak. And I think that that's a good example of a reverse. You know, some people just really do not like that feature. So as we're evaluating and assigning our classifications, cost is something else that we might be considering. And once the classifications are really assigned for each user story, then the prioritization can be used to plot out a product roadmap. And generally user stories that are over here on the left side of the screen, so the basic, the attractive, or the performance, the ones that are classified as that make it onto our roadmap. And the ones that are classified as indifferent or reverse do not make our roadmap. And as we said kind of toward the beginning, our Kano model is really best used when we're trying to identify the features we want to include from a customer satisfaction perspective. All right, we've got relative weighting up next. And this is a prioritization technique that considers lots of different things and can be set up to really consider lots of different things. As I was looking on this one, I kind of found this particular formula that focused in on benefit and cost and really did a comparison around that to come up with a numerical calculation that can then be used as comparison or relative comparison for user stories. So for each user story, we're looking at these 4 values that are on the screen, and we're also assigning a scale of 1 to 9, where 1's the lowest score and 9 is the highest score. And we've got a benefit score, which is simply the benefit of having the feature. We've got the penalty score, which is the drawback if we don't put the feature into play. We've got a cost score that identifies how expensive a feature might be, and a risk score that identifies how risky a user story will be to build. And once we've got each number assigned, then we're simply plugging it into that formula and making the calculation. And so in this case, we're going to take the sum of the benefit score and the penalty score, and we're going to divide it by the cost score and the risk score. And what we end up with is, like I said, a series of numbers that are assigned to our user stories. And then when we sort those, the highest values would be the ones that we would consider to be the most important, and the lower values would be the least important. Our last example of prioritization is what we call the $100 test, or sometimes it's referred to as cumulative voting. And it's a way to let participants vote using dollars, and they can assign those dollars to various user stories. So the way it works, the participants review the user stories, and then they place their dollars onto the user stories that they think add the most value to the business. And once each participant has spent their full $100, then the dollars for each story are counted and added up and stored into the product backlog. And this gives us a cumulative dollar amount, or points, sometimes it's referred to as points, for each user story, and allows the stories to be considered in highest to lowest priority order again. So it's just another way to signify which items are most important to the organization and which are least important. And as a Scrum Master, you're facilitating that session. So you might put some rules in place for it. One example is that you might say a minimum bid has to be $5. And so as you're putting in that, that $5 minimum, it just lets people not really spread their money quite as thinly. Or you might say that you can only bid on 10 different user stories. Again, it's just trying to say, if you're bidding $1 on, like, say, 100 user stories, that's just not as useful in the voting process, and as you're trying to figure out a prioritization for items on your backlog. So this just recaps what we've been talking about for project prioritization, or I guess I should say user story prioritization. We talked about the Moscow, which divided things into 4 categories. So that was our must-have, could have, must-have, should have, could have, and won't have. Then we had our Kano, which is really focusing in on customer satisfaction. And that's where we took the basic, the attractive, and the performance and said those are probably the ones that make the cut to be on our roadmap. And the indifferent and the reverse are probably the ones that we're not going to worry about. We looked at relative weighting. Remember, that was a calculation. We were looking at benefit and penalty versus cost and risk. And lastly, we had the $100 test, and that's where we were giving people $100 to basically spend on user stories and make their votes for which ones are most important. So prioritization is just really one component to our Agile project planning. And next up, we're going to spend some time talking about estimating and sharing some different ways that we can estimate what is on our product backlog. So for estimating, we've got our same key players. You'll see the same 3, our product backlog, our Scrum Master, and our product owner that we had on prioritization. But we're going to add one here. We're going to add the Scrum, or sometimes it's called a development team. And some of the people who were involved previously are going to have different responsibilities as we move into the estimating process than what they had in that prioritization process. So the product backlog's key component remains the user stories. The Scrum Master is going to continue to organize and facilitate our estimating sessions. And our product owner really becomes important in a different way here. They're going to be helping that Scrum team understand exactly what's needed and provide some clarification on user stories as we go through the estimating exercises. So the Scrum team is made up of all of the individuals who will possibly be completing work on user stories. They didn't participate in the prioritization, but they are key in estimating the user stories. And they work to understand what's needed and to seek some clarification from the product owner. They provide user story estimates and assign the work to the user stories to the project team members. So as we go through the various estimating techniques on the next few slides, you're going to see some overlap in concepts. And this just adds a little layer of complexity in explaining the techniques. And I'll try to do my best to go a little bit slowly and make sure that I'm explaining things in a good fashion for everyone so that everyone can understand. First up, we've got affinity sizing. And this is an estimation technique that we use when we have lots of user stories on our backlog. And when we're trying to quickly provide an estimate for those user stories. So the way affinity sizing works, we have a scale. Basically, it's a horizontal scale. It goes from small on the left to large on the right. And as we go through affinity sizing, we generally place that scale onto like a large table or a wall that has a large amount of space. And the Scrum team members, or remember, those are the people who are going to be doing our work, they go user story by user story, and they place them onto the wall according to where they think it fits on the scale. So one way that they're doing this, or one example of how to do this, is to have the first team member take a user story and put it onto the wall. The next team member then has the option to move a user story that's already been placed on the wall, or they can place a new user story onto the wall. And as user stories are moved or placed on the wall, their estimate is considered from a relative perspective. So they're asking themselves the question, is this the same size as another user story that's already up there? Or is it larger or smaller than another user story? And how much larger or smaller is it than something else? So prior to placement, the team member could ask questions that get some clarifying information from the product owner in order to make a better decision about where to place that user story on the wall. As an example, maybe the team is presented with a user story that says, I need to paint the house. So the team member might ask some clarifying questions, such as how many colors are we going to be using? What's the home square footage? Am I painting inside the house or outside the house? And as you can imagine, if you're painting like a Victorian house that has lots of ornate trim, it might be much more complex to paint that than it would be to paint a standard ranch style house. So the team member in that case would place the user story onto the board according to how big or small they felt the user story was, and they would be basing that on the clarification that they got from the product owner. After all of those user stories that are on the backlog have been placed onto the wall, then the team members step back for just a little bit and review the board. And they're really looking for anything else that they might need to move around. At this point, they might seek more clarification from the product owner. But once they've gotten the agreement and the team is satisfied with where they've placed things on the wall, then the team takes a step to really divide the stories into groups. And as they're dividing them into groups, generally speaking, there's some pretty clear lines that can be seen vertically, really. And so they're kind of where things kind of have spaces in between, they're drawing those vertical lines. And after they've done that, then they can place a scale on top of the affinity sizing chart if they'd like. So they might place something like a T-shirt size reference over top of it, or maybe it's Fibonacci numbers that they place over top of it, or some other numbering scale. It's really just a way to offer a little more categorization and be able to translate that into an actual value that we can recognize from an estimation perspective. And we're going to dive into the T-shirt sizes and the Fibonacci numbers here next. So T-shirt sizes, as we talked about on the previous screen, can really help with estimating by providing just a guide of relative size for user stories. We might use a scale of extra small, small, medium, large, and extra large, or maybe the team prefers to use just small, medium, and large. Either way, it's really something that we're, again, using when we have lots of user stories and when we want to make quick estimates. That's probably where it's pretty useful. And kind of taking it back to our affinity sizing that we were talking about just before this, when the user stories are in that affinity scale and we've grouped them into like sizes, the team might choose to put t-shirt sizes over the top of that. And so they might have like a small, a medium, and a large category that get assigned over top of that. And again, it just really helps with future discussions when we're trying to figure out when we can complete a user story and where it fits in with our work that we're working on. And now we're going to move on to Fibonacci numbers. And again, this is another popular estimation tool. It's a numerical scale. It's something that we use in the Agile world. It's a sample of it is on the screen right now. And really that sample is a bit of a modified version. And I'll explain next why that's modified and why we call it that. But the traditional sequence for Fibonacci numbers is that we take the previous two numbers, add them together and get the next number. So in this scale, we would take like 2 plus 3 and get 5, or 3 plus 5 and get 8, and so on. The 20, the 40, and the 100 are different than what we would land at for numbers if we were doing the true Fibonacci scale method. And the reason that we kind of stretch them out just a little bit is to give a little more separation between the numbers so that it makes it a little bit easier as we're looking at large things to be able to classify them. And these again can be overlaid onto that affinity sizing that we were looking at. There are also items that can be assigned by themselves to the product backlog. And so there, you can just assign a numerical value off of this, or we can use them in other ways. And we're going to get to those other ways here as we move forward in our slide deck. So our next way of estimating is called story points. And these are really another way to estimate the user story on the product backlog. And story points are utilizing relative values also. They can incorporate many different scales. So some teams might want to go sequential. Maybe they want a 1, a 2, and a 3. Or maybe they chose to do a 2, a 4, an 8, and a 16 scale. Or maybe they want to include the Fibonacci numbers here as they're doing their story point assignment. But regardless of what scale the team is choosing, when they're estimating each user story, the team will assign a value based on relative size again and comparing it to other user stories. So they might start by picking a user story that they think is in the middle of their scale. If we were using the 2, 4, 8, and 16 scale, maybe they're picking something that sits at that 8 mark. And then that story becomes the point of comparison for the rest of the estimates that they're providing for user stories. And so then when the next user story comes up, they're going to look at it and say, is this the same as the last one? Would I score it with an 8? Or is it larger and I would need to do a 16? Or maybe it's even larger than that. And in that case, it might be an indicator that I need to break it out into a few more smaller user stories to be a little more accurate with the estimate that we're providing. Or on the other hand, is it smaller and is it more a 2 or is it a 4? Is it a little smaller or is it a lot smaller? And so those are kind of the questions that go through minds as you're assigning story points. And as the team is doing that, they're also considering the risk, the uncertainty, and the complexity of the work that's ahead. And so they're looking at a user story from lots of different perspectives and really thinking about it in terms of the size, the risk, the uncertainty, and the complexity. Flip that with traditional project management, where estimates there are really in an hour perspective, and lots of things happen on an hour scale. In the Agile world, we don't worry about the hours. It's really about how large or small things are relative to other things and how complex they might be to complete. And the last estimation tool we're going to talk about today is planning poker. And this method is really used most often when there's a smaller amount of user stories on our product backlog. And the reason for that is that it's a much slower estimation technique than many of the others we've been talking about today. It's one that really requires collaboration and consensus. And because of that, it just tends to be a little slower and take a little more time to arrive at an estimate. Planning poker is really all about using some cards, and that's how team members are completing the estimating process. So each team member gets their own deck of cards, and generally their deck of cards contains a sequence of numbers. Think Fibonacci numbers. So to start planning poker, the product owner shares the details of a particular user story. The Scrum team might seek clarification from the product owner after they've shared the initial details. And once that Scrum team is comfortable that everyone is ready to make their choice, then everyone chooses the card from their deck that they feel most accurately represents the estimate for the work that's ahead. And at the same time, everybody reveals their cards. If everyone agrees, that's great, and the estimation work for that user story is all done. But if they don't agree, then the team engages in further discussion. And the team pays particular attention to estimates that are either on the really high or really low side of kind of the consensus of where most people landed with their estimate thought. And so the team members are going to review their people, I guess, the estimates that were either on the really low side or the really high side. And after they've done that, then the team members will make a new choice and share their cards again all at the same time. And that same thing continues until a consensus or agreement has been reached and everybody is happy with the estimate that will be applied to the user story. So as an example, let's focus on a user story that says the pool owner will deep clean a pool weekly. And let's assume we don't ask any clarifying questions up front. And most individuals say this is a 5. We'll use the Fibonacci scale in this case. But one individual said it was a 1 and another said it was a 20. So the facilitator or the Scrum Master is going to ask the individual who voted with a 1 to explain their vote. As they do so, they share that they assumed the pool was just a kiddie pool. It was something that they only needed to dump out each week, wipe the pool down, and then fill it back up with water. Wouldn't take long at all. The individual who voted with a 20 is then asked to explain their reasoning. And they say they marked it a 20 because they assumed they were cleaning a really large in-ground pool and that they had to manually brush it, manually vacuum it, and manually skim it on a weekly basis. But the majority assumed that they were cleaning a medium-sized above-ground pool. They still had to brush and vacuum and skim it, but of course it was much smaller size than the large in-ground. And so the team spent some time getting some clarification from the product owner, and they share additional information about the pool cleaning responsibilities and the pool size. And they confirm that they will in fact be cleaning a medium-sized above-ground pool. And so the team revotes, and as they revote, then everybody lands at a 5. So they've got consensus, they're able to record that estimate in the product backlog and move forward. And this process continues for each of the user stories that are on that product backlog. The resulting estimates can then move forward into the sprint planning, and we're going to talk about that right after we do a recap on our estimating techniques. So here's just a quick refresher of the estimating techniques that we watched or talked through. We talked about affinity sizing. Remember, this is good when we have lots of user stories on our backlog and we're trying to quickly provide some estimates. So it goes from a scale of small to large. When we're done placing all of our user stories, we might put another scale over top of that. So we might put T-shirt sizes over top of that. We might put Fibonacci numbers over top of that. Our T-shirt sizes are another good way to do a quick relative estimate, and we're just kind of classifying things maybe small, medium, and large, and really moving through quickly our backlog of providing an estimate. Our Fibonacci numbers, remember this is our scale. We used a modified one. It was 0, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, I think 20, 40, and 100 is where we landed with that one. Again, can be used kind of standalone, or it can be used with several other things on our estimation technique options. Story points, we were assigning relative numbers based on a value scale that the team agreed upon. My favorite for that is the 2, 4, 8, and 16. And then planning poker was where we were doing really a collaborative estimating technique, and we had to come to consensus before we were able to provide an estimate and move on to the next. So now I want to kind of take us into the concluding leg of our presentation, and I want to talk through an example of how what we've talked about might be applied in a real project or a real Agile project. Our project starts with the product owner, and they're recording the user stories onto the product backlog. Once those stories are available, then the product owner is going to review and prioritize them. And for this example, we're going to pretend there's other stakeholders who need to weigh in, and it won't just fall on to the product owner. So we're going to use our $100 test that we talked about earlier for prioritization. So each stakeholder is given $100 in fake money, and all the user stories are placed onto a table, and the stakeholders move around the room spending their dollars. When everybody's spent their $100, the voting stops, and the dollars spent on them are added up and counted and added up together, and then they're recorded onto the product backlog. And those user stories can then be placed and used to rank order that list. And so they're going to be looking for what are the things that are most important. And those are the things that fall into sprint planning consideration at the beginning. And so then we're going to move on to estimation. And this is where the Scrum team needs to agree on the estimate for each of the user stories. We'll just use the story points and the scale of 2, 4, 8, and 16. So once our user stories have also been estimated, then we can record those values, and then we're ready to start. We've got our prioritization and we've got our estimation, and then we're ready to start our sprint planning. And the sprint planning is really looking at that backlog, and it's identifying the subset of work that we want to carry forward and try to accomplish inside of a sprint. And a sprint is really just a time-boxed event. It's generally a 2-week time frame, with the goal that we're identifying meaningful user stories that we can deliver value and deliver something that can be completed within that predefined sprint timeline. And so the amount of user stories that we include really depends on the Scrum team. It depends on something called their velocity. And that's really the expected amount of work that they can complete within that sprint timeframe. If it's the first sprint for that project, or even for that Scrum team, we might not know their velocity just yet. And that's okay. We can just do our best to pick what we think can be done in that 2-week time frame, and then we can adjust as we need to. So during planning, the team might choose to further build out user stories. They might break them into specific tasks, and the individual team members can work on either the user story or the task level, and that's how they get assigned. But once the team member has their work defined and they're ready to go for that next sprint, then we place the user stories for that sprint onto something we call a sprint backlog. And then we're moving those into kind of our working model. And that's where we go into more of a cadence of we're having daily stand-ups, and each person in those stand-ups is talking about just 3 things. They're talking about what they've completed since yesterday's meeting, what they plan to complete today, and they're sharing any impediments or issues or blockers that have presented themselves and that they need help resolving. Once a team member has finished up a user story, then they're going to select from the list of sprint backlog items, another user story or another task to assign to themselves and begin working on. And probably the hardest part of these daily stand-ups is that you have to remember, particularly coming from traditional project management into Agile project management, is to remember not to dive clear down and try to solve the problems during the sprint meeting. Really, the sprint meeting is just for sharing information, and then follow-up meetings get set up to dive into any details that need to be discussed or worked through. So then toward the end of a sprint, the team is going to reserve time with the product owner and perhaps other key stakeholders. And they're really reviewing the deliverable. At the end of the session, they're going to ask if the product owner approves of everything and is ready for them to launch. If they are, then that's great, they can move on. If they're not, then they might have to go back and do a little bit of rework and have that discussion again before they're ready to launch. But at the conclusion of that and the conclusion of a particular sprint, then we're doing a retrospective. And the retrospective is taking place really to talk about three different things. We're talking about what went well during that sprint, what didn't go well during that sprint, and what changes the team would like to incorporate going forward. And so then following the retrospective, we go back and we take another subset of that product backlog and we move it into a sprint. We do our sprint planning and we move it into a sprint backlog. And then that's kind of an infinite loop as we continue working on the project. This is just a really quick sample of the sprint backlog. Notice that it's a subset, like I said, of the product backlog, and it's also tracking a few additional pieces of information. So for example, we might choose to track the assigned to information. We might choose to track if it's been approved to launch or not approved to launch. And so those are just kind of key components that go into the sprint backlog. And again, I used a simple Excel document here. It's not necessarily what happens in the real world, but was an easy way to depict that. Before we close today, I do want to take a moment to share references that I used as I pulled this information together. And I also wanted to say a special thank you to Jen Birch. She actually helped identify the topics for today's presentation, and I'm really grateful for her input. I hope you found today's deeper dive on Agile project prioritization and estimation useful. And I know we covered a ton during this, so thank you for your attendance, and let me know if you have any questions.
Please feel free to put any questions in the chat or turn on your mic and ask.
So thank you so much. This was an amazing presentation. My name is Amanda Major, and I don't typically deal with projects for IT. I'm usually do like a workshop with a website, and we do a lot of planning for iterations to these resources we provide for professional development. We don't have user stories, so we might have like, okay, well, let's plan an event, a small event, as one of our items on our board, and then like a number of, I guess, user stories involved. So I don't know what your advice is in regards to maybe we should be more specific with our particular events and work through it that way for our Agile planning, or maybe I'm sort of facilitating a portfolio rather than with a bunch of little projects rather than a project. I don't know.
Yeah, so Amanda, I think, there's lots of different ways that you can tackle initiatives. And you're right, I am very much heavy in the IT world. But if I think about it from a non-IT perspective, and I think one of my favorite things about project management is the keyword flexibility. So there's not necessarily any one right or wrong way to do it. It's more about what's right for you and applying the concepts over top of that. So if you have a good, like list or wall or whatever that works for you, then I think it's more about just applying maybe some of those techniques tied to Agile to those items. So maybe you're doing a prioritization of the items to figure out which things, as you're getting ready for an event, are critical, and which things, if you get to them, that's great, and the customers who are attending that event may really love it. But if you don't, that's okay too. And then it's about kind of planning that, how long is it going to take? And I don't mean how long in terms of time, but how long in terms of, relativity compared to other things. So that's what I would tell you. I don't know if that was super helpful, but I think it's about being flexible and finding what works for you guys.
Kris, it is helpful, and I don't want to dominate your time, but I just have so many questions. So I'll ask one more.
Okay.
And that is in regards to like the team I work with, they have too many things going on at once. And so our velocity is just, it's hard to estimate, right?
Mhm.
And then it's hard to adjust. So I don't know if you could offer any advice around planning velocity and then adjusting it.
Yeah, and that's a hard thing. And I find it particularly challenging in higher education. And in particular, because there are so many ebbs and flows of what happens at various times of the year and who you might have involved or engaged in working on it. So I think, I don't have anything really great off the top of my head in terms of better ways to work through that velocity other than through experience. And you may find, over time that, like, I can give you an example for us. I know our registrar's office is going to be checked out at the start of semesters and when registration is going on. And so then I might purposely, as I'm doing some planning and thinking ahead, I might purposely say, okay, our velocity maybe drops in half during that time. And if I drop that in half during that time, what does that do to my overall time scale? Can I still make it, or do we need to think about having maybe a longer time scale? And so those are things that might be options for talking through or thinking about as you're looking at that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and certainly if you have other questions, you are more than welcome to get a hold of me offline, and I'd be happy to go back and forth a little bit. All right, I'm just scrolling up to see if there's any other.
You have one question from Stephen Wilkes in the chat. He
Okay.
said, I'm trying to use Agile for a smaller IT team that tends to be more specialized in their areas. I have been attempting to implement Kanban because of the team size. Any recommendations for small teams with a large backlog? We cannot add resources due to budget constraints.
Yeah, that's a really tough and common situation. Again, I think for that, your prioritization is going to become a really key factor there. So when you have more specialized team members, you're maybe not able to as easily manage assignment of user stories or of tasks in a way that person one can also work on the same thing as person two and person three. So where they have more depth in their skills, and you get a little more diversity there. And so when you can't do that, then I think it really becomes about figuring out what are those really key deliverables and focusing in on those first. And it then becomes an exercise of chipping away at that really large backlog. And unfortunately, I wish I had a better option for you there, but I really think prioritization is going to be your key.
Thanks, everyone. Any last questions for Kris?
So I do see one more that popped in, Lisa, and it was, do I have any ideas on capacity versus velocity tracking or reporting for executives? I haven't done that at the executive reporting state, really. I have done it within the project team, and it was actually a piece that I omitted just for the interest of time today. But there are ways that you can kind of track your, your capacity and your velocity and report it out into kind of a nice visual. So that is an option, but I don't have any real specifics from an executive perspective.
Thank you. Let me go back to sharing my screen. Thanks so much, Kris, for volunteering to do this presentation. The project management community group is always looking for volunteers. There's a few topics up on the screen now that we're looking for volunteers to speak on. If you have interest in any of these areas or any other area, we'd love to have you join us as a presenter. Right now, we are also looking for 2 new members of our steering committee. So if you have an interest in joining the PMCG leadership team, we'd love to hear from you. I'm going to post the link to this survey in the chat if you're interested. I know John Preddy, the other co-chair, he posted it on the project listserv yesterday, but it's an interest form, and we're asking for interest to be submitted by July 25th. A few of our upcoming events to call your attention to, we'll be having a regular meeting in August and September. And then in September, we're going to have 2 different meetings. So you can see those on there. And in October, we'll break for our annual conference, but we are planning on having some sessions in Philadelphia as well as through the virtual conference, if you're planning on attending that. And again, our next meeting is going to be August 17th at 2 o'clock. As always, we encourage you to look at many of our online resources. And thanks again, Kris, for today's great presentation. We appreciate it. Thanks everyone for coming. The recording of the session will be posted online. So if you'd like to share or rewatch. Thank you.